By far the most disappointing team this year was Florida State. After nearly a decade of mediocrity, Mike Norvell finally got the Seminoles up and going in both 2023 and 2024. This was led by a good quarterback, a stout defense, and some really good weapons. Florida State blew up and honestly should have been in the 2024 college football playoff, but due to an untimely injury, they got left out due to the quote-unquote eye test. Again, I think Alabama was more competitive in that game, but on paper, Florida State absolutely got screwed. They went undefeated in a Power 4 conference and managed to get left out of the playoff. Again, they probably would have gotten killed, but on principle, it was awful. Florida State had an opportunity to get revenge though. They could go into the bowl game against Georgia and show they were competitive, and they could bounce back in 2024. Unfortunately, that would not end up happening. Instead, half of their team opted out and they got skull crushed by Georgia, and then they decided to become the worst Power 4 team in college football in 2024. What's funny is this was not supposed to happen. The Noles were a preseason top 10 team, they brought in supposedly a really good quarterback, and they plugged in all their weaknesses and holes with players from the 2024 transfer portal. That's what I'm going to focus on today. We're going to talk about Florida State's disastrous 2024 season, more specifically, their disastrous 2024 portal class. Honestly, none of these guys really did anything for Florida State in 2024, and this season was just an absolute wash. We're going to talk about the guys they brought in, how they ended up doing, and why it contributed to such a bad season. But before we get started, if you're a big fan of college football, be sure to subscribe to the channel, leave a like if you support today's video, and let me know what player, team, topic, or situation I can cover next. Now let's get started and talk about this disastrous 2024 Florida State portal class. Alright, so the first position group I want to talk about is the quarterback position. Back in 2023, they ended up having 3 guys who started the game. Tate Rodemaker ended up starting after Jordan Travis got hurt, and Brock Glenn would start in the ACC Championship game. Neither of them were really all that important to the season, but Rodemaker did have 5 touchdowns. Jordan Travis was the true star of the show, as the 6th-year player ended up throwing for 2,800 yards with 20 touchdowns and 2 picks, and also had 7 touchdowns on the ground. He was extremely important, but as I said, he would end up getting hurt. The guy they brought in to replace him, they ended up bringing in 2 different guys to replace him, one of which was a big-time recruit in Luke Kromenhoek, and the other was DJ Uiagalelei. We all knew this guy was coming, as the former 5-star who played at both Clemson and Oregon State took a huge NIL deal to go to Florida State. Honestly, we had all seen this movie before. He had been hyped up all offseason, and he was supposedly going to finally figure it out. I cannot tell you how many times I've heard that over the last 5 years. What DJ decided to do instead was disastrous. He ended up only throwing for 1,000 yards with 4 touchdowns and 6 picks before an injury would end his college football career. Quote unquote end. DJ was absolutely abysmal in their first 2 games against both Boston College and Georgia Tech, and man, he just looked defeated. I truly felt bad for DJ honestly at this point, as he could just not cut it, and mentally it seemed like he was just done. After that, Brock Glenn and Luke Kromenhoek took over for the remainder of the year, and neither really could get anything going, as they both struggled with turnovers. The next position that Florida State needed to replace was the running back spot. Back in 2023, they had 2 big-time running backs in Trey Benson and Lawrence Toafili. Benson went off to the NFL with the Cardinals after having 900 yards and 14 touchdowns. In 2024, Florida State would bring in 2 different players to try to replace his production at the running back spot. The first was Roydell Williams, who was a former big-time recruit who played a couple of years at Alabama, and the other was Jalen Lucas, who was an undersized back who was also good on special teams. Neither of these guys ended up pretty much doing anything in 2024, as Roydell ended up finishing 7th on the stat sheet with just 53 yards and 2 touchdowns while averaging 2 yards per carry, and Jalen Lucas literally had 2 carries. To be fair, both of these guys ended up with season-ending injuries, but still the return on investment was not great. They really needed some production at the running back spot to replace Benson. They ended up getting about 55 yards out of it. Moving on, Florida State ended up having one of the best wide receiver prospects in the 2024 NFL Draft, and that ended up being wide receiver Keon Coleman. They also sent both Johnny Wilson and Jaheim Bell off to the NFL, so they lost their top 3 pass catchers and 15 total touchdowns worth of production. In 2024, they would need a guy to step up immediately, and they grabbed 2 big names out of the portal. They got Malik Benson and they got Jaylen Brown. Benson's been hyped up for quite some time as a speedster, and he did end up finishing 2nd on the team with 25 catches for 300 yards and 1 touchdown. Brown, on the other hand, ended up having 8 catches for 75 yards. To be fair, Benson was the second best wide receiver on the team, but still his production was not all that great, and he transferred to Oregon once again after this year. I don't really know if Brown was ever supposed to have that big of a role, but he didn't end up doing anything either. So far, they whiffed on the quarterback spot, got 2 guys at the running back spot who both got injured, and then both their wide receivers didn't really do a whole lot either. Florida State ended up losing a couple of offensive linemen from the 2024 team, and did bring back one of the better offensive line coaches in the country in Alex Atkins, but he ended up getting in hot water at the beginning of the season. Florida State would bring in 3 different offensive linemen to try to fill the gaps, as the first one was TJ Ferguson, as he'd end up coming in from Alabama. Then you'd also have Richie Leonard IV, who'd come over from Florida, and finally Jacob Rizzi, who came over from Harvard. I'm not really sure how much these 3 guys played, but Florida State's offensive line was by no means solid this year, so the return on investment was also not very good. If there was one spot where Florida State desperately needed some good play, it was on the defensive line. They ended up losing Jared Verse to the NFL, who went with the 19th overall pick to the Los Angeles Rams after he was an absolute superstar for the Noles for a couple of years by way of Albany. They got him out of the portal a couple seasons prior, and they also got Braden Fisk from Western Michigan. Fisk was a second-round pick to the Los Angeles Rams as well, and both of them did great in their rookie seasons, and these guys would completely dominate for Florida State's defensive line. To replace that production, they ended up bringing in 4 total players on the line from the portal, which the first one was Sione Lolohea, who ended up coming from Oregon State. How did he end up doing? Well, he had about 7 total tackles and half of a sack. They didn't get a whole lot of production out of him, and he was a 4-star transfer. The next guy they brought in was Tomiwa Durojaye, as he was considered a 4-star transfer from West Virginia. How did he do? Well, he had 3 total tackles and 1 sack. He did nothing either. Grady Kelly ended up coming in from Michigan State, and he ended up having a total of 7 tackles and 1 sack. So far, they have gone 0 for 3, so maybe they would hit with Marvin Jones Jr. I mean, this guy was a huge name in the transfer portal, as he was a 5-star out of high school and a 4-star transfer from Georgia. How did he end up doing? Well, he was actually alright. He ended up only having 10 total tackles, but 4 of them were sacks. They ended up getting decent role production out of him, but I think they expected him to come in and be a lot better than that. The guy everybody was super excited to watch was Patrick Payton, as he was definitely the next man up on their defensive line, but he also had a little bit of an underwhelming season, and as a 5-star transfer is now headed over to LSU. So yeah, they brought in 4 defensive lineman transfers to replace their 2 All-American caliber players, and they got about a total of 6 sacks out of it. I guess that's decent, but most of the guys did not end up hitting. Another great player Florida State had in 2023 was Tatum Bethune. He ended up getting drafted in the later rounds of the 2024 NFL Draft, and they would bring in 2 different players to try to replace his production. The first one was Sean Murphy, who was a 4-star transfer from Alabama. How did he end up doing? Well, he had 6 total tackles. Just like a lot of the other guys on the list, Murphy did not end up really doing anything. Finally though, after a ton of players, we finally get to Florida State's first transfer who really lived up to the hype. One of the guys they brought in at the linebacker spot was Cam Riley, and he was one of the more unheralded guys. Sure, he was a 4-star coming out of high school, but he was only listed as a 3-star transfer coming in from Auburn. Riley would end up becoming one of the better players on the team, as he would finish with a total of 47 tackles, 1 pass deflection, and 1 forced fumble to go along with the sack. He was definitely in the upper tier of players on that Florida State defense, and one of the more unheralded guys became one of the better ones. It's interesting how that works. And finally, we get to our last position group on the team, and that is the corner spot. They ended up losing Renardo Green to the NFL Draft, as he was one of the top corners in the ACC that year, and to replace that production, they'd end up bringing in a couple of guys. The first one was Omarion Cooper, as he came in from Colorado with a lot of fanfare. How did he end up doing? Well, he had 2 tackles. Cooper did absolutely nothing for Florida State and is now off to Memphis. The next guy they brought in was a player by the name of Devontae Brown. He was a 3-star transfer that came in from Miami, and he didn't end up doing much either. He had a total of 13 tackles, and I guess will be back for the 2025 season. Finally, they brought in Earl Little Jr., who was a top 100 recruit coming from Alabama. Little was seen as a guy who could make an instant impact, but he really didn't do much either. In total, Little had 1 sack to go along with 15 tackles. Not great production out of any of those 3 guys, and this is a big reason why Florida State was no good in 2024. They had great skill players, a good quarterback, a good defensive line, and a good secondary in 2024, and they ended up bringing in a quarterback who was terrible. They got 2 running backs who got injured in the first couple games of the season. Their receivers did not match the production of the guys they lost. Their offensive linemen didn't do much. Their defensive linemen were all a whiff. They got one good linebacker. So Florida State's transfer class was ranked 7th overall. And out of the 17 guys they brought in my opinion, Cam Riley was by far the best transfer they got. And then they got decent production from both Malik Benson and Marvin Jones. Those are the only 3 guys that I really think did anything, and that's a big reason why they sucked. Florida State hit the portal once again hard in 2025, and maybe Mike Norvell will be able to flip the roster again, but if you can't do that in this day and age, your team is not going to be any good, and that's what happened to Florida State this year. They whiffed on most of their transfers, and that's just the sad reality of it. But what do you guys think? If you're a Florida State fan, what do you think went wrong for the 2024 portal class, and what topic should I do next? Be sure to let me know down below, leave a like if you support today's video, subscribe if you're new, and check out one of the videos on the end screen. Hope to see you guys again soon, but until next time, peace.